All right. Well, hello and welcome to the Hometown Church podcast. Thank you guys so much for joining us. My name is Jesse Rosskamp. I'm joined, as always, for the Mark series by Pastor Brett Knox.
It's a great day and it's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here joining us. This has been such a fun series. I love just being able to just sit down and dive into the Word and just dissect it and hear from it on its own terms. And I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful gift.
And I think we do a pretty good job talking back and forth and exchanging thoughts.
Yeah. I think it's been a wonderful, wonderful exercise, a wonderful thing for us to do, and hopefully it's been a blessing to you guys out there as well. We hope to continue to bless you with this.
It's just a blessing to you and I.
Maybe it has been. It's been to me. Actually, I did get some feedback just the other day of someone reaching out talking about Mark chapter 5, saying how much they enjoyed that and hearing the story of the bleeding woman. Great. Yeah, so it is. Someone out there is being blessed by this. But today we are continuing that series as we go through the Gospel of Mark, focusing on the message, mission, and identity of Jesus as revealed through his Gospel. We continue today with Mark chapter 7. To this point, Jesus has been traveling around the region of Galilee. He's been spreading the news of the kingdom of God. He's been healing the sick, revealing his identity along the way to his disciples and the people around. And last week we read about Jesus being rejected in his hometown of Nazareth, sending out the 12 apostles, the death of John the Baptist, the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus walking on water. Just a whole loaded chapter. And this week we read stories of Jesus pushing the boundaries when it comes to religious traditions, especially against the Pharisees, and expanding the bounds of the kingdom of heaven past the people of Israel. So it should be a really fun conversation. But before we get into the actual text, is there any background information for chapter 7 that we should know about?
I think the background information to note is that Jesus is just creating controversy, and the controversy seems to be intensifying. And we see that here in this chapter. Even in verse 1, it says, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. So they're now starting to travel to see Jesus. And Jesus keeps going on with his ministry, teaching who he is, demonstrating by his deeds who he is. He's talking about how the kingdom of God works. And what is happening is that's leading to smashing Jewish paradigms and smashing their pride. And so he's rubbing the Jewish authorities the wrong way, and the tension is just really starting to build. And he challenges their identity. We're going to see their practice of how they do cleanliness and all their cleanliness laws. And Jesus challenges that. And I think we got to recognize, in a sense, he's challenging their very identity, what it is to even to be Jewish. And of course, they don't like that. He's highlighting their hypocrisy, and they don't like that. And maybe even along the way here in this chapter, we find out that Jesus is also convicting them of their sin. And finally, we see him heal a Gentile woman, and that probably rubbed them the wrong way. So the tension is rising. Yeah.
Jesus isn't afraid to be bold and be direct, and that's, I think, what we're getting here today. That's wonderful. So let's just dive right into this. We're going to start with Mark chapter 7, and we're going to read the first 23 verses, which, as you mentioned, this is Jesus confronting the Pharisees about traditions and commandments and what truly defiles a person. So I'll start in verse 1. One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand-washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they have poured water over their cupped hands, as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. This is but one of many traditions they have clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of religious law asked him, "Why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition? They eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." Jesus replied, "You hypocrites! Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. For you ignore God's law and substitute your own tradition.'" Then he said, "You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God: honor your father and mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, 'Sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what I would have given to you.' In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents. And so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. And this is only one example of many others." Then Jesus called to the crowd to come and hear. "All of you listen," he said, "and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You are defiled by what comes out from your heart." Then Jesus went into a house to get away from the crowd, and his disciples asked him what he meant by the parable he just used. "Don't you understand either?" he asked. "Can't you see that food you put into your body cannot defile you? Food doesn't go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer." By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. And then he added, "It is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of the person's heart, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you." Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. All right. So, I think it's really interesting how Jesus kind of confronts this issue with the Pharisees. How is Jesus teaching here redefining religious faithfulness to God's commands?
Well, I think this passage has two main points that we'll probably want to dig into here. And the first point, which I wonder if it's the primary point, is what is true purity? How does one become impure or unclean? And then how does a person rectify that? And what Jesus is doing here is he's redefining purity by teaching that impurity or sin comes from the heart. It's not coming from outward actions, but it's coming from evil thoughts and actions that come from the heart, not from a failure from observing ritual washings. And so I think that's the main point. And then there's a second point that Jesus is getting at, is that they're equating the traditions of men. These Pharisees had all these traditions that weren't really even listed in the law, but they had their own traditions that came over years, and they put them on the same level as the commands of God, and that was a mistake. But I wouldn't mind digging into the primary point, the first point first. What's true purity, and how does somebody become unclean or impure? And the real key verse here seems to be is verse 20, and he says, "It is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you." And so Jesus is changing their paradigm. Sin comes from within the heart. The problem that we have is from within. And it starts from within and works out, whereas the Pharisees seem to have a different paradigm. Their religion was outward, and if you could get the outward right, then it works in, and Jesus is flipping that. And in a sense, if change is going to happen, it's going to happen within our heart. And the implication here is it's a lot harder to change your heart than it is to change what you're doing outwardly. And in a sense, Jesus is describing in verse 20, 21, 22, on what's really wrong with the world. I mean, what's really wrong with the world? Why is this world such a miserable place? Why is there so much strife between marriages and in our marriages and between nations and races and tribes and classes? Why do relationships fray and fall apart? And what he's saying is, what's wrong is us. Yeah. It's within. It comes from the inside. And, it gets so personal. In fact, I was thinking about this lesson. I was reminded, I was praying through Psalm 19 the other day, and I came across this verse in Psalm 19. David is he's saying, let's see if I can find this. Oh, who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Well, right there, we see the psalmist saying, we've got hidden faults inside of us that we don't know anything about. Mm-hmm. That it comes from the inside. And I think this is what Jesus is getting at. And it's interesting that Jesus doesn't discuss the solution for that. He doesn't say, well, here's how you fix the heart. But that is going to be the message of the gospel down the road, that we need a transformation from the inside. Our heart is the problem, and the heart needs to get changed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really good. That's been something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is this relationship between identity and behavior. I think this is something that Paul talks about a lot in a lot of his letters, especially like Ephesians is where I'm thinking about, where I think it's an idea that stems from Jesus, and they're very much the same here, is that your behaviors are just an outflow of your identity, right? And a lot of times we are disappointed with our own behaviors. We're not doing the right things, and so we try to just attack each behavior. Like playing whack-a-mole, where like I want to get better at this thing, so I'm going to really focus on doing this thing better. But what Paul says and what Jesus says is that no, the solution is to attack your identity, is to have a complete identity change and recognize who you are. So Paul talks about it in the context of live into this new creation. You are a new creation. Live into that identity, and then your behaviors will become an outflow of that. Eventually, it might not all happen at once, but your behaviors will eventually start to change and mold and shift into becoming more like this new person. And what Jesus is saying is like, you need to become a new person. Like you need to have a purified heart and become this new thing.
Right. And so, you have new creation is critical. Yeah. It's only the power of the gospel that creates that, gives us a new creation, changes our heart, and then you live out of that. Right.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about that in the context of two areas in my life that have changed pretty significantly over the last several years. And one is running, and one is reading the Bible. Those are two things that I've just come to love, and I've become like very passionate about, which is very different from when I was a kid, and I hated doing both of those things, growing up. And I've had the question asked to me a couple times of, let's start with running. Like someone will ask me, when did you start to love running? And I was like thinking about it, and I was like, well, maybe it was like the first time I experienced the runner's high. You go for a run, you break through that barrier, and all of a sudden you start to feel really good. And I'm like, but I don't think it was that. I think it was actually before that. I think it was, I think it was when I decided to stop saying I'm not a runner. I started in training. I would watch like a bunch of videos on like, how do you start running and how do you start running. One of the things that they very much emphasized was you got to start calling yourself a runner. You got to identify as a runner. And so as a runner, I chose to start loving running, right? Because that's what a runner does. A runner loves to run. Even though I hated running, it still was terrible. Like I still hated it, but I was a runner. So I was going to go out and run, and I was going to do this thing. And eventually over time, I actually began to enjoy it. I began to like have fun with it and have a good time. And I'd be smiling as I was running, which is just such psychopath behavior. But it stemmed from this identity thing of like, now I'm a runner. And it was the same thing with the Bible. Like I always didn't enjoy reading the Bible. But I made a choice at one point to say, no, I'm a Christian, so I love the Bible. I believe this thing is good. And I had that identity change, and so I started living into that identity. My behavior started to change, where I started to read my Bible more consistently. And as that went along, I began to actually really enjoy it and really enjoy diving into it and really enjoy seeing all these things. So I think that's so key to understanding how our behaviors are just a reflection of our identity rather than the way we change our identity.
Yeah. So you might be equating our identity as the heart,
Mm-hmm.
what our heart's like. And I think someone who is emphasizing outward religion
Mm-hmm.
Misses the heart.
Yeah.
This is what's going on with the Pharisees here, is they're not so concerned about their heart
Mm-hmm.
as much as they're concerned about their outward traditions, their outward religions, their outward habits. And that leads to all sorts of problems here. They create these man-made traditions, all these washings that went beyond the law, traditions that were not found in the Mosaic law, but they were developed by elders along the way to kind of safeguard themselves, make sure that they would never get ritually impure. And it went all the way to not just washing their hands, but washing their cups, pots, and I even understand the couches that they sat on, especially if they're coming from the marketplace. They didn't want to risk any kind of uncleanliness, and so they created all these safeguards, and then it became a law for other people to follow, and it's just such a concentration on your outward behavior, and they never really looked at their heart. And then, I think they also missed there were legitimate issues in the law for cleanliness that were there, but they missed the spirit of it. The problem with the Pharisees, they missed the point. The laws pointed to Jesus and Jesus' ability to truly cleanse a person. That's what all those laws were designed for. It was to foreshadow Jesus, but they made that, they were practicing those things, but missed Jesus.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really good. Yeah.
And by the way, can I say, that's the problem with outward religion. Doesn't challenge your heart.
Right.
Doesn't challenge your heart. You can hide behind religious practices and say to yourself, well, I'm doing my duty. I'm proving myself, proving myself to God, proving myself to others. And it kind of leads to pride. I remember when I was in the Boy Scouts, we would earn these things called merit badges.
Yeah.
And we'd wear this sash across our uniform that put our merit badges on it. And the more merit badges you had on there, the more you could feel good about yourself and be proud in front of other people. Well, religion can kind of be the same way. You put these little merit badges on. Well, I cleansed my hands today. This is what the Pharisees are probably thinking. I'm pretty good. And it leads to feeling proud about your religion. And it also leads to criticizing others,
right?
Ostracizing others. You see them criticizing Jesus because Jesus isn't wearing the same merit badge sash that they are. So anyway.
Yeah, and the problem there comes when your identity becomes wrapped up in what you do rather than who you are.
Yeah, there you go.
Right, because then when somebody comes and challenges that, or you're not able to do that, or someone does it in a different way, it becomes an attack on you,
right, rather
than an attack on the things that you're doing. And so it becomes crushing when those things get taken away or challenged,
right?
Like it was for the Pharisees. That's why they respond so harshly to them,
right?
So consistently, because their identity is so wrapped up in their actions and their practices and their the things that they do,
right, as opposed to the issues that were going on in their heart. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's really good. So, what would be some like modern equivalents to this story today for us?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because this could go. We could answer this in a lot of ways. I think it would be any religious or even non-religious practice that we're counting on to prove ourselves to God and look good in front of other people. It could be any religious practice that helps us to avoid the real problem we have, which is our heart. I mean, I just think of a couple quick possible examples, and there could be countless. But I remember when I was growing up, I had several friends of mine who were Catholic, and we would party on Friday night. They would get up early on Saturday and go confess their sins at church in front of the priest, get the slate clean, and then we'd go party again on Saturday. And I always thought to myself, that just doesn't seem right. But it gave them, that outward practice gave them the conscience that they could go sin again on Saturday night, you know. Or I think of another one that just recently a lot of people have done leading up to Easter, giving up something for Lent. And I wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit later, but it's just this outward practice. Oh, I can give up something for Lent, and I can prove to myself, prove to other people, prove to God that I'm spiritual.
Yeah, that's good. I think one that was kind of, I might get in trouble for this one.
Go for it.
But
make this controversial.
Yeah, the one that was kind of popping up on my mind was like tithing.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting one.
Yeah. One from the sense that as a person, you can be like, well, I'm good. I'm giving my 10%. Right? Like, so I'm good with God. Like I've paid my membership dues or whatever. And then on the flip side of that, I think some churches can use that as like a weapon against someone. If you're not doing this thing, if you're not, or we'll set up this practice, and it's like, if you don't do it exactly the way that we want you to do it, now you're becoming sinning. And it's like, well, what if I do it in a different way, right? The command is to be generous, that we're supposed to have this generous heart. And so now we've created this tradition where you have to be doing it in this certain way. And if you're not doing it in this certain way, you're doing it wrong. But then also as a heart check for yourself, you can say, well, I'm giving my 10%, so I'm good in generosity. It was like, are you living self-sacrificially? Are you actually fulfilling the heart of the command and going further with it? Right. So I think it can be used kind of in both ways.
Well, this is what it becomes tricky is that we can turn good things into bad things and I'm defining bad as we take a good thing and we turn it into a habit of proving our self-righteousness or a way of proving ourselves to God or to other people. So another possible example would be like just simply going to church.
Yeah.
You know, some people have turned it into a badge of righteousness and say, I've got to go to church every Sunday. And if I miss one, then, you know, maybe I sinned. It becomes like another merit badge you put on. I did my duty. I went to church. Now going to church is a good thing.
Yeah.
Right. But it can become a bad thing, depending on what your motivation is. Maybe even the frequency of your quiet times with the Lord.
Yeah.
You know, if you're wearing that as a badge of spirituality, well, if you fail in it, then you get really discouraged, perhaps. Or it's a way of to measure yourself towards other people. How many times did you get with the Lord this week? You know, and you feel better than somebody in your small group because you had a consistent quiet time this week. You can take any good spiritual habit and turn it into outward religion as a way of measuring yourself or measuring other people.
Yeah. I think a good way of like kind of identifying that, because I've heard this before, is like you ask someone, are you a Christian? And if they respond with, yeah, I read my Bible. Yeah, I go to church.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I tithe. Yeah, I pray.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool, you do things. Are you a Christian?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a focus again on outward practice as opposed to what's going on in your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that kind of ties into the next question, which is like, how do we tell the difference between what's tradition and what's actually command?
Well, I mean, there's probably a few questions we could ask ourselves about this, but first of all is, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible exactly say? Well, again, the Pharisees, driven by their heart of wanting to prove themselves to be super religious, they invented traditions that went beyond what the Bible says. And we're warned, don't go beyond what it says. So that's where we start. What does the Bible say? What does it doesn't say?
Yeah.
The Bible doesn't say thou shalt go to church every Sunday, but it does say be devoted to fellowship. So, what does the Bible say? What doesn't it say? I think something that's a little bit more nuanced is another question is we need to understand what the purpose of the Old Testament law is. There are things that are written in the Old Testament that don't necessarily apply to us today. They're not relevant today. That they are the ceremonial law, for instance, was fulfilled by Jesus and points to Jesus. So we need just because something might be written in the Bible, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's relevant for us today. And then I think we just need to understand, I think might be the biggest one, is understanding our own motivation. Are we doing things out of love for God or as a way to prove our own righteousness? And are we doing things because they're like spiritual merit badges to us, or are we doing things because we love God? I think those are three tests, three things that we could go through to get a grid of how can we tell the difference between tradition and command.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think Jesus is kind of just a really good example here for us in that that when the Pharisees come to him to challenge him, they challenge him with their traditions, and he responds with Scripture.
Yeah.
Right. He takes it back to the Word. Well, what does the Word actually say? So I think that's just a wonderful, really good example for us. And the last kind of thing I want to touch on here in this realm is this idea of are traditions inherently wrong, or do they hold any sort of value for us today? And if not, at what point do they become wrong?
Well, that's really good. I think traditions can be fine if they sincerely lead us to God, if they sincerely help us develop our relationship with God. In one sense, in the simplest form, traditions are just habits. All right. So we can and we should create our own habits. Like I will get up at 6:00 every morning, and that becomes my habit. You could say over a period of time that becomes my tradition.
Yeah.
But it's a good one because it gets me up in the morning to, seek God. However, what happens is that good habits can become traditions in a bad sense, or even can become corporate traditions that eventually the heart is lost behind it. I think an interesting example is what I mentioned earlier about giving up something for Lent. That tradition is traced back to about the 2nd or 3rd century. Somebody, I don't know how it all started, but somebody was probably, it's all based on, by the way, Jesus fasting as he prepared for ministry when he was out in the desert. Somebody was probably meditating on that and think, you know what, I should give up something to prepare myself for ministry. All right. And that was a good habit. It was probably a good thing that God placed on their heart to do. And it became a corporate church tradition over the years. And by the time the Middle Ages came around, the idea of giving something up, whether a particular food or a luxury or habit, became a feature of Lent for 40 days based on what Jesus did for 40 days of fasting out in the desert before he opened up his ministry. Well, it lost its heart somewhere along the way. People just thought, well, okay, I just need to give something up and I can prove myself to God and kind of prove to myself that I'm a good Christian, as opposed to, listen, there could be a really legitimate sacrifice that I need to make in order for me to become more available to God and for him to use me in life. I don't think people are using that, giving up for Lent for that reason.
Yeah.
So I'm just using that as a little bit of an illustration of how a good thing can end up becoming perhaps a suspect bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's value in tradition. especially when you get to the heart of whatever tradition. Like, because a lot of these things, there was a lot of thought and a lot of care and a lot of passion that was put into those things, especially when you look at some of like the traditions of some of the more traditional sects of Christianity, right? And when you actually trace the roots, there's a lot of like really beautiful things in those traditions that are like good if you get to the heart of them, but they've kind of been lost and forgotten over time a little bit. And so most people who practice them don't even really think about them. They just kind of go through the motions.
Right.
But I think there is something good when you get to the heart of those things. And I think when you set up traditions for yourselves, like habits, right? Like I love that you use that word, that they're really just habits.
Right.
And then they become wrong when you start to push those things on other people as laws, as commands, as requirements for other people's. But when you hold them for yourself and you hold to them for the reasons that you're supposed to be holding to them, as like a heart thing, as an act of obedience, I think that can become something very, very beautiful in that. I also just think it's really interesting that we kind of get these like cycles and patterns with like generations, where one generation will set up these traditions and they have like a good heart towards it, and then the next generation will be like, well, that's not actually in the scripture, so I don't have to do that, and they push back the complete opposite way.
Oh, sure, right,
and become like ultra free. I can do whatever I want. I'm gonna exercise. Like, say a parent is like, I don't drink alcohol. I'm never gonna touch the stuff because I want to do as an act of obedience, and the child goes, well, the Bible doesn't say you can't drink. Like, you can have drink. And then they just go completely in the opposite direction and are drinking as much as they want. And then the next cycle looks at it and goes, well, they're way going too far for this. Now I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So there's kind of like this constant back and forth as traditions kind of and generations are like kind of going, I'm going to go ultra freedom, I'm going to go ultra restriction, ultra freedom, ultra restriction. And so we see these kind of just patterns and cycles as the generations go on in response to these things. And it's like, how do we find a good middle ground for those?
Right. Again, I think a large part of this goes back to the heart. Mm-hmm. And I think you made a good point about traditions or habits that we can create for our own spiritual good. But then if we start insisting that others should do the same, then that's where we start getting into trouble, because then there's something behind that. There is a pride behind that what we're doing is our spiritual badge of honor, our merit badge. Now I want you to do it. Mm-hmm.
Get on my level.
Yeah, right. So it's the motivation and the heart behind our habits or our traditions. If it's helping us grow our own personal relationship with God, that's great. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be applicable to other people.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Anything else from this section before we move on?
Nope. I think we nailed it.
We nailed
By God's grace.
We got it. All right. Well, we will move on to the next story here from Mark chapter 7, which is the story of the Syrophoenician woman, which is verses 24 through 30. And that says this: Then Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in, but he couldn't keep it a secret. Right away, a woman who had heard about him came and fell at his feet. Her little girl was possessed by an evil spirit, and she begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. Since she was a Gentile born in Syrian Phoenicia, Jesus told her, "First I should feed the children, my own family, the Jews. It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied, "That's true, Lord. But even the dogs under the table are allowed to eat the scraps from the children's plates." "Good answer," he said. "Now go home, for the demon has left your daughter." And when she arrived home, she found her little girl lying quietly in bed, and the demon was gone. All right. The Syrophoenician woman.
A tough one.
Yeah. So this is an interesting story, I think, because of how it can get used and attacked in the culture today, especially within our context. Because there's been some modern interpretations that I've heard of this story that paint Jesus to kind of be in the wrong here in how he responds to the woman initially, claiming that maybe his response here was filled with either racism or misogyny or something like that, and she's the one actually correcting him, which I think we both agree is not the case here. But I'm curious as to how you would respond to that claim.
Well, and it's through the years, it's also made me raise my eyebrow here, thinking, is Jesus calling this lady a dog?
Mm-hmm.
You know, was this a kind thing that he said? Was this, is he equating her with a dog? You know, there's some Greek implications here about that term dog is not as bad as we English speakers might think it would be. But I don't think that there is any racism or misogyny issues that are going on here. I think, though, Jesus is pointing out his mission priority. And Jesus came to a particular geographic region for a reason. And he was born as a Jew for a reason. He was first a Messiah to the Jews. He's the person who's fulfilling all the hope of the prophets that were Jews. And the Messiah is a Jewish thing. He's first preaching the kingdom of God to the Jews. Now, yes, later on as the gospel expands, the Gentiles, as Paul explains, were grafted in. And I'm sure glad that as a Gentile myself that I'm grafted in to all the promises that were given to the Jews by the Old Testament prophets. So we're grafted in. But Jesus had a priority, and it was to the Jews first. And yet, through the Gospel of Mark and other Gospels, we see really key times where Jesus is reaching out to Gentiles to give us a taste, a foreshadow that the gospel and his ministry is intended also to the Gentiles. But his personal ministry in these short 3 years that he has, his priority was to the Jews. And I think this story illustrates that. Yeah,
I think that's a really good response. I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, but the interesting thing here with the Greek is the word for dog that he uses, because there's a bunch of different words for dogs, and a lot of them are derogatory. But the specific word he uses here is kunarion, which is a little bit more specific, and it refers more to like a household pet, which is interesting. Still pretty low status.
You think, does that take the edge off maybe a little bit? Yeah,
but there is a sense of like, well, there is love and affection and care for the pet, but it comes after the child, right? Like if you have your kid and your dog, and you can only feed one for the day, you're feeding your kid first, right, and the dog comes second. But you still care for and love for the dog, and then there's this sense that the Greeks and the Gentiles are actually going to be grafted in and adopted in as children eventually. But there's a process, there's a progression that happens. That's all part of the plan.
That's right.
Yeah. I think more so the point of the story here is on the Syrophoenician's woman's response to Jesus, and how she approaches him in this situation. So I'm curious, is just what do we learn from her response to Jesus here?
Well, I think the whole positive part of this whole story is her faith, and again we see it's so ironic that there are certain instances where Gentiles in the ministry of Jesus had greater faith, greater hunger, greater desire than many of the Jews themselves. And even though many of the promises of the Old Testament are directed at Jews, here this lady sees an opening, and she's fervent, she's hungry, she's seeking, and she gives this very clever reply. She's persistent, and then Jesus commends her for her response, grants her request, heals her daughter. And I think it's just another encouraging story about how Jesus responds to faith.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think it's testament to humility too. Approaching
yeah.
Jesus in humility, right? Because she could have responded with, "I'm not a dog. What are you talking about? Like, like I'm a mother. I'm doing all these things. Like my daughter's sick, and you're not going to heal. You're going to sit here and call me a dog." No, she says, she recognizes her need and her status when it comes to Jesus, and she humbles herself, and she doesn't fight back, but she still responds in faith.
Well, I think you hit on a really important point. She recognizes she didn't deserve anything.
Mm-hmm.
And she's counting on Jesus' mercy.
Right.
Isn't that the same place that we need to be in?
Yeah.
That we don't deserve anything. I mean, Mary and I often will say around the house, when something good happens, and she'll say, "Well, you didn't deserve that." And I said, "That's true. I deserve hell." We don't deserve God to do anything for us.
Yeah.
What we deserve is hell. She was so humble enough to realize that she didn't deserve it, but she's also recognizing that Jesus is responsive and he's merciful.
Mm-hmm.
So she's going to go to him and ask anyway.
Right.
I think the humility part here is very instructive for us.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, it would have been wrong for Jesus to call her a dog if it wasn't reflective of her true status, right? And she recognizes that, and Jesus responds accordingly.
And aren't we sinners?
She was a dog, and so was I.
So right.
Yeah. Well, anything else from the story of the Syrophoenician woman that's sticking out here?
No.
All right. Well, we'll move on to our third and final story from this chapter, which is the story of Jesus healing the deaf man, which is verses 31 through 37. And that says this: Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon, before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. A deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. He put his fingers into the man's ears. Then, spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." Instantly, the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone, but the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They were completely amazed and said again and again, "Everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak." The story of Jesus healing the deaf man. So this is a really interesting story. Just in regards to how Jesus goes about doing this, right? Because we see Jesus healing in a variety of ways. Sometimes, like with the woman, the Syrophoenician woman, right? He just spoke from a distance, and
healed
the
at
girl
distance, didn't even need to touch her.
Didn't need to touch, didn't even need to see her, didn't even need to go to where she was. He just speaks and it happens. Sometimes it's reaching out and touching someone reaching out to touch him, touching the fringe of his garments, right? But here he does this whole thing where he's putting his fingers in his ears, he's spitting, he's touching him, he's touching on his tongue. If he can heal on command, why go through this whole show?
Well, that's a good question. I got two possible answers to that. One is it could be as simple as the man was deaf. So what good would it have been to a man for Jesus to speak if he couldn't hear? And maybe Jesus did put his fingers in his ears and touched his tongue, would have been a form of nonverbal communication demonstrating to the man by touching him because he couldn't hear what was about to happen. So it could have been simply practical. But there may have been a bigger reason here, because there has been so many different ways that Jesus went about his miracles, that his variety emphasizes the fact that healing comes from divine power and not from a particular technique or a ritual. You would kind of see maybe down the road as people were thinking, could turn it into, well, Jesus touched them, or Jesus did this, or Jesus. It could have been a focus on the outward things, but he does a variety of things just to show people it was his power.
Yeah, yeah. So they can't point to any one practice and say,
Yeah.
well, if we do it this way,
That's
then
right.
we can recreate
That's
it or
right.
anything. It's just like, well, he did it this way this time, and he did it this way another time. Yeah.
It's not a matter of our technique.
Right. It all stems from him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I like the point of well, yeah, he was deaf and mute, you know, so he can see what's going on, but he can't hear. Jesus can't communicate with him other than kind of going through this whole show of looking up to heaven and sighing and spitting and doing all these things to kind of visually clue him in on what's going on. And I also think it's just really interesting, especially in regards to the conversation we just had earlier about like cleanliness with the Jews, where if this man had like a hearing impediment, a speech impediment, like that became something that was like very scary for the Jews. They saw it as like an uncleanliness thing, and so there wouldn't be any like touching of him, right? That's the source of his uncleanliness is his tongue and his ears.
Okay.
And so now Jesus is entering into this thing. He's not afraid to go and touch the man's uncleanliness and enter into it with him. And so he's seeing this and seeing Jesus come to him in his brokenness, in his state, and not and spread goodness to him, spread healing to him, rather than his disease, his infection is spreading to Jesus.
So a little bit like Jesus' willingness to touch people who had leprosy.
Right. Yeah.
And then heal them. Yeah.
Right. To go hands-on in order to heal people, which is part of what's inspired like modern day hospitals, right? It came out of that idea. It came from Jesus followers who saw Jesus go into people's afflictions and not be afraid to get into the mud with them in order to bring about healing. And that's where the idea of modern hospitals came from. And most modern medicine and practices, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so here we also see just Jesus continuing to charge people not to tell them others about who he is and what had happened, but it just keeps happening anyway. So I'm curious, just why does Jesus continue to do this if he knows they're going to share it anyway?
Yeah, this has always kind of intrigued me going through the Gospels. We've kind of talked about it a little bit before, but this time I dug into it a little bit.
Yeah,
and I found that Jesus repeatedly instructed people not to publicize his miracles. We see it happening here, and it's a phenomena that scholars call the messianic secret. I think that's interesting. And there's a variety of speculations that scholars will give on why Jesus wanted to keep the wraps on stuff, the messianic secret. And I'll mention 3 or 4 of them just for food for thought here. Maybe it's because he wanted to avoid some premature conflict. The more that he did these miracles and the more that it got talked about, created a possible threat for the Romans and a threat to the Jewish authorities. And I think Jesus wanted to be careful of creating the conflict too soon because he had a mission to go on and he wanted to control the message. Jesus needed a little bit of time, I think, to redefine what it meant to be the Messiah. In first century Judaism expected a conquering political leader. They didn't expect a suffering servant. And so trying to keep a little bit of wrap on the miracles could help shape his followers' understanding that his true mission was to be a suffering servant, not necessarily a miracle doer. So he's trying to keep the narrative right, and he didn't want people to focus mostly on his miraculous power. So you see him teaching, and so I think there's various reasons why he wanted to keep this under wraps a little bit, because it could take his whole mission in a direction that he didn't want it to. So those are some possible reasons.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think it's really helpful. It's so strange. It's just like every time he talks about it, it's just like, don't tell anyone. And then they immediately go tell everybody. It's just like, Man, why even try it this way?
This is fruitless. They don't do what I tell them to do.
They're like sheep without a shepherd.
Well, you get the idea. Jesus, even though he's doing miracles, he's not beating the pan on the miracles.
Right.
Other people may be, but he's not beating the pan because he knows this is not my main thing.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got bigger things on his mind.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, anything else from Mark chapter 7 before we wrap this thing up?
I think we did well.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. Thank you for joining me for this series. It's been so much fun going through this. I'm really looking forward to continuing. After next week, we're halfway through the Gospel of Mark, which is crazy. We've been cruising through this thing. And next week we'll be reading chapter 8, which is kind of the first major shift in the story as Jesus kind of takes his ministry from Galilee and starts heading down to Jerusalem about halfway through chapter 8. So we'll be kind of making that shift in the focus of the story, which will be fun. But for now, that's all we got for you. So as always, if you're watching on YouTube, we got audio versions of this up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you're listening to this, know that we have a video version of this. If you want to sit and watch our faces as we talk about Scripture, you can do that. I recommend just the audio version.
I'd recommend that too.
Yeah. But yeah, let us know if you have any questions or comments or encouragements or anything like that you want to share with us. It's always a blessing when we get to hear those things. You can reach out to us at podcast@hometownchurch.com. But for now, we'll see you next week.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye. Wow.